Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the Prince George's County Historical Society for tonight's history chat, Young and Old Ward 4 Cheverly. I'm Donna Schneider, the Society's president. We are recording this chat, so please mute your microphones. For any questions you may have, please put them in the Q&A box, or I guess the chat box, sorry. And we will ask them of Joseph after the chat. If you enjoy these chats, please think of becoming a member or making a donation to the Historical Society via our website, www.pghistory.org. Tonight's conversation is with Joseph Pruden, who will chat about being young in Cheverly's Old Fourth Ward during the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Joseph has lived in Cheverly since March 1957, when he and his family moved to Ward 4 from Fort Ord, California. After college and serving in the U.S. Army as a military intelligence officer, Joseph made his home again in Cheverly with his wife, Susan, where they reared another generation of the Pruden family, and where he is active and supportive of the local community. During his chat with John Peter Thompson, Joseph will talk about being a young man in Old Ward 4, including adventures and activities that shaped his life, how families and neighborhood friends were always there to support each other, as well as the changes that happened in the 1960s that led to the end of official segregation. Thank you for joining us, and John Peter, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here hosting or interviewing and talking with Joseph. I want to preface this with, sometimes I think we hear the word history and we think big dusty books back in the library that nobody reads, about people nobody knows, with hand-drawn images of things we don't understand. And I thought it important that we get a little living history here, even if it is the memories, and talk about what some people would say recent history. But since I was alive during this time, I don't think of it as history, but I know it is history. And I think it's important not only talking about things 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, but things 50 years ago, because that's history too. And that's something so important. And so, Joseph, thank you very much for joining me for this chat. And that's about as much as I'm going to say. I thought we'd start with the title, Young and Old Ward 4. What's Old Ward 4?
Well, first, thank you for this invitation. I've been looking forward to it, and I hope we just enjoy it. You and I have talked quite a bit in the past, and if we keep it to that tone, we're going to be just fine. And maybe along the way, we'll make some new friends, and some people will get some new insights into Fourth Ward. If we could have the first map up, Amanda. This is the current map of Cheverly, Maryland, with its current ward makeup. Just like any other town, it's pretty much divided by population. Doesn't look anything special, and I have to preface, I could not find anywhere a copy of the map before this one, which showed the distinction between the Fourth Ward and the rest of Cheverly. On the next map I'm bringing up, it's the same as this one, but I've put a red line to show you where Route 50 is and the railroad tracks are, which go along where Metro is now. That red line separates the rest of Cheverly from the Fourth Ward. The Fourth Ward was isolated from the rest of the town geographically. There was a natural barrier of a Beaver Dam Creek, I believe it was the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks and Route 50. In order to get from one side to the other, you had to cross, which was then an old steel girder bridge. And now it's a nice concrete bridge. We're still separated, but we've been incorporated a little bit more, and we can go into that later. So when we talk about the old Fourth Ward, or we're talking about that part at the bottom right of your map, below the red line. It made for interesting division between us and them, or this side of the town and the other side of the town. And we'll cover some of that later. But that was the way the town was divided when we moved here.
So Joseph, moved here is my cue to ask, and in the introduction, so your family came here in 1957, is that right? And do you want
That's
to talk
correct.
a little bit about why they came here and sort of life and family in the late 50s?
We moved here in March 1957. I was in the 4th grade. So for you math geeks, you can do some calculations. The rest of us, let's just roll with the punches. My dad was a career Army chaplain, and he was about to be sent on an unaccompanied tour to Korea, which meant we either would stay at Fort Ord or we could move somewhere else before he shipped out. My mother was from Richmond, Virginia. Her sister and her sister's husband, my aunt and my uncle, were at the time living in Maryland, in Addison Park, Maryland, Addison Chapel, I'm sorry. So they decided to move here so we could be closer to the family in general, but closer to my aunt in particular. My aunt looked around for us and she made friends with Mr. Curry, Wayne Curry's father, who found a home for rent on 61st Avenue in Cheverly and sent pictures, I guess, communicated, and that's where we moved when we came here. We spent like 2 or 3 days, all bunked together in an apartment, 7 of us, and then we moved into the house.
So Joseph, a little bit of name dropping for those who are younger. Mr. Curry, Wayne Curry, who was Wayne Curry?
Wayne Curry eventually became the county executive for Prince George's County, and he was the first Black county executive for Prince George's County. He had some other firsts in his life too, and I hope to cover a couple of those as we go along, but Wayne was a go-getter. His father was the vice principal at Fairmont Heights High School, so we knew the family very well, and my aunt Sue knew the family very well, and she was the godmother for Wayne Curry.
So family then is the reason that you came here, to be close to family, and I'm going to sort of expound on family and life in Ward 4 in the 50s and 60s. I think that's where we should go.
Yep.
Family.
Family is the reason we moved here. And it was probably the best move my part of the family ever made. We came here, we got very lucky and moved to Cheverly. In spite of all the things that you may have heard about segregated Cheverly or desegregated Cheverly, what we found when we got here was a family community. There were still white people living in the 4th Ward at that time. One of our neighbors, I believe her name was Nancy, got to be a very good friend of the family. We didn't have any problem with most of them. And I don't think we had a lot of white flight. We probably had 6 white families in the 4th Ward when we moved here. I'm pretty sure 2 of them moved out because we were moving in. The rest, I think, just moved by attrition. They got older and moved in with their children or moved to smaller houses. And eventually the 4th Ward became almost entirely Black. But having said that, in particular, the street I lived on, it was just a huge family. Everyone looked out for everyone else. The kids were in and out of everybody's houses all the time. We ate meals at each other's houses. We had annual events on the street. So for my family, it was the perfect move. And I have nothing I can say that is negative about that.
When your father then went on his mission to Korea, did your mother work?
My mother did work. She taught school. My mama was a teacher all her life. She finished college while she was still a teenager and was teaching while she was still a teenager. When we moved here, she began teaching at Fairmont Heights High School. She was hired by G. James Golson, who was brought into the county to start a Black high school. Mr. Golson has a school named after him now, and he was a force to be reckoned with in Prince George's County. But he molded that school into his image and made sure that he could get the best people he could get there. But Mom went there as a teacher. She eventually became a guidance counselor, and she moved on to become a vice principal, a principal, director of student services, and she retired as assistant superintendent of schools for Prince George's County, and she was the first Black female to hold that position. So for those of you who are a little older, my mother's name was Parthenia S. Pruden, and most people knew her as Pat Pruden. So when Dad was overseas, Mom ran the household, unlike many other women of the time. She was a substitute for him. She was the head of the household, and we just moved on.
Can you tell me a little bit about life as a young man then? I mean, what did you do for fun? Just describe being a young man in Ward 4.
All right. There were, in the 2 or 3 blocks around us, there were a ton of children around the same age. It's almost as if all the people moved into Cheverly at the same time, had their children at the same time, and we all grew up together. There was a core of us from 61st Avenue, probably about 10 or 12 children who were, if we grew up now, we'd probably be more like a gang than a bunch of friends. But we were all friends, and I guess the best way to describe some of it is to name some of the names. Across the street from us was the Groom's family. The kids there were a little bit older. They were slightly older than me, but we hung out together. And when my Uncle Bill came to town, I got to hang out with him more because Bill was a little older. And so he and Bob hung out together, and I got to tag along with them. Next to them was the Watkins family. And there were the 2 parents and 3 boys. Richard, Chuck, and Steve. Steve still lives in the family home. Chuck is the one I mentioned before we went on the air, who now lives in Silver Spring. And Richard was a vice president for Cisco, but he is no longer with us, but he's well remembered. And then across the street, we had the Jackson family. Down the street were the Robinsons in the Hills, and I can still remember the names. But I think for my mother, and later on for us, the most exciting time was when I mentioned we had moved into a rental home. The house next door to us came on the market, and we bought that, so we moved into a home we were owning, and that became our family home. But my aunt and uncle and 2 cousins moved into the house next door to us. We knew they were coming. We were excited cousins were coming, but I'm sure for my mother, that was just primal life. Her sister was living next door to her. So we had actual family next door, and then the rest of the street was inherited or developed family. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you describe the house a little bit? What were the houses like, or just describe the house?
It's on 61st Avenue in Cheverly. And if I'm going to lead to the side, I tried to make this my background. That house behind me is the house that we bought and we grew up in. And it was the family home until my mom passed away a few years ago. So lots and lots of people have been through that house, friends, neighbors, family, and we'll see some family pictures shortly. The house on your left is the one we rented. And the house to the right is where my aunt and uncle and cousins moved in, the Curry family. No relation to the other Curry family. We had, looking back, and just like any other kid growing up, you think you know what's going on in your neighborhood, but you don't realize as much until you grow up. But looking back, we had remarkable I don't want to call them role models because they weren't playing a role. They were just the best images we could have had. I'm going to show you some pictures that kind of highlight what I'm talking about. But my uncle Jim was a principal, but on the summer he ran a recreation center for kids. Between him and my dad, they would pile all the neighborhood kids into cars and take us to the swimming pool. That does not mean the Cheverly Swim and Racket Club. I didn't know that place existed until I was adult. They would haul us into DC. We'd go to Banneker, East Potomac Park, Langston. We'd go to all the public swimming pools in DC, 10, 12, 15 of us at a time. And then they bring us back home. And so we had a ball going there. And that's the kind of thing they did to make sure we had influences outside just the street. They took us to movies. They took us almost always as a group. And we used to try to figure out what the world record was for getting number of kids into one car. I believe we're stuck at 15, but that was before seat belts and
I guess I have to ask, what kind of car?
Well, the one that I remember right now it was a Buick Electra 225, which makes no sense to the younger people, but it was a huge monster of a car, a long engine portion and a long trunk, big old seats, and you could sit a bunch of kids in the seats, some in the laps. The front seat was a bench type seat, so you could put a few up front. And as I said, no child seats or seat belts, so it was just pile in any way you can.
You mentioned that there was a pool in the rest of Cheverly that you didn't know about. So this geographic division, it was a real geographic division. It wasn't like you could look across the tracks and see what was going on. It was it was a different planet in some sense for a young person. It was over there somewhere.
It was, and my brother heard of it, I think, but our travel didn't take us through Cheverly that much. I was asked about entertainment and grocery stores, and the truth of the matter is when we left the neighborhood, we pretty much left in a car. When I got a little bit older, my buddy and I would walk to catch the bus, but the nearest bus was at Sheriff Road and Eastern Avenue. And for those of you who care, you can look it up on the map and see what kind of hike we had. It was probably 3 miles, maybe a little more, but there were no buses at the corner. So if we decided to go to the movies, we would go down, catch the bus, and go to Benning Road, Minnesota Avenue, the Town Theater, any of those, because we also didn't go to the theater in well, it was Bladensburg then. It's now called the Cheverly Theater, or Cheverly Theater. So when we traveled, we kind of traveled in ruts in the road. And even if I had gone through the regular rest of Cheverly, I wouldn't have seen the pool, but we just didn't even know it existed. I believe Mr. Price and his wife were the first ones to integrate the pool in the other part of Cheverly. And it was kind of on a trial basis. I can't tell you what year that was, but
can you tell me a little bit about, so now I'm intrigued, you walked 3 miles to the bus stop?
I would have to measure that, but I'm guessing
roughly. It was more than a 30-second walk to the bus stop.
No, it was a decision. We didn't do it without thinking about it and planning it. So, you know, young teenagers, you want to go to the movie or something, and you know, you just the two of you, and you can't drive because you don't have a license. And if you did, you might not be able to get the car. So you walked to the bus stop and caught the bus and then rode into whichever theater had the movie you wanted to watch. So no, I don't think there were buses in the other part of Cheverly either at that time. So this was not a Fourth Ward thing, but it did become one when the buses started running through the other part of Cheverly.
And for our younger people, there were no subway stops either.
No.
Yeah, right. Yes. Speaking of buses, so how did you get to, so when you came to Cheverly, what grade were you in again?
Fourth grade.
Fourth grade.
Fourth
so
grade.
Where did you go to school?
I went to Beaver Heights Elementary School, which became a social service center, and I believe the building is now gone. If you know the area, you go up past Fairmont Heights High School, past Golson, and you keep going past where the food factory and the bakery used to be. It's almost at Addison Road, and we walked there.
How long a walk was that?
It was probably about a mile, not a long distance, but as I told my nephew, it was uphill both ways.
Yes, I remember that too, because
And it really was uphill both ways.
both ways.
But there were shortcuts that we weren't allowed to take through the woods and across Billy Goat Mountain. So we walked up the streets to school. And
Okay,
then-
I have to ask, Billy Goat Mountain?
I don't know. That's what it was called. So we called it Billy Goat Mountain. It was
All
a
right.
big dirt hill, a big dirt. It had trees when we first got here, and they cleared it because they were going to build a food processing plant there.
Got it. So
Then I went to high school at Fairmont Heights High, which was a little closer walk. My class at Fairmont Heights High was the last class to go there for 6 years. We went from 7th to 12th grade. Then they built Bethune Junior High School between the two schools that I attended. And my brother and sister both went to Bethune and then Fairmont Heights High School.
that's right. Fairmont Heights was built, I think, opened in 1952 as a mid and high school combined when it first opened. That's
Correct.
right. All right, not to derail you a little bit
It's
here.
okay.
So you have adventures as a young man in your town, in your community. Want to describe some more of those? So you go to the movies. Did you do any sort of random walk searches outside of the ward?
We did.
And how?
And I'm trying to stick to the 50s and 60s, which were
Right.
kind of our guidelines.
Yep.
A block behind our house was a huge, not a forest, but a lot of woods. It went almost over to Cabin Branch, for those of you who are familiar with the area. There was a cement processing plant near Sheriff Road. And then eventually Safeway Distribution came in on Cabin Branch Road, and there were railroad tracks. So we explored the woods constantly. My brother reminded me recently that we used to play in the big, huge warehouse on the concrete plant grounds. We're lucky to be alive because we didn't have sense enough to know how dangerous that was. We would climb up a catwalk that was bent backwards. I'm sorry, climb up a ladder that was bent backwards up onto a catwalk and then jump up on off onto this huge hill of aggregate, which could have come down on top of us at any time, but we didn't know that. We would hop on our bikes and ride over to the railroad tracks where we discovered a field of wild blueberries, blackberries, strawberries, and some other kind of berry. And we sort of kept that as a secret. That was our secret lunchtime feast. And I think my mom finally found out about it one day and then made us bring stuff back home for jams and pies. But again, we were lucky we didn't poison ourselves because we just saw these blueberries, they tasted good and we ate them. So
Right.
you do these things when you're a child. But there were also a couple of excursions. If you remember back then, there were a lot of activities in the general Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And some of them everybody could go to, and some of them only certain people could go to. But we weren't quite as aware of that as we might have been because our parents worked around that. The Watkins family either owned or a friend of theirs owned a piece of property down at Mill Point Shores, where a lot of people in this area went down during the summer.
Where is that?
You know, truth, I think it's St. Mary's County, but I'm not positive. It's on the water. And Amanda, there are two pictures there with the kids in the water. If you could pull up one of those, please.
So these
There,
would be
those two.
these would be day trips.
They would often be overnight trips because there was a house there.
Ah,
And when I got a little older, the younger kids used to go down there and spend a week at a time on occasion. But there's a picture of some of the kids from 61st Avenue from left to right. It's my cousin Karen, and I believe she's on the line. So Karen, it's a fuzzy picture. They don't really know what you used to look like back then. And then, oh, I think that might be, no, that's not Harold. I'm sorry, I don't remember right now who the next one is, but next to that is my cousin Jim Curry. And then the big kid there is my next youngest brother, James. Between Jim and James is the youngest, George. And then that looks like Richard on the right, Richard Watkins. Go on to the next one, would you please? And it's the same group of kids. That's Karen, then Richard, and then Chuck. No, Karen, Steve, Chuck, Richard, James again, James Curry, and my brother George Standing. So the kids got to go. This is not a saltwater beach. This is a bayside beach, so it's fresh water. So, but we didn't know the difference. We were at the beach. We got to swim in the water. We got to barbecue and grill. We got to sleep in a house overnight. So those were the kind of things that the families in the neighborhood made sure we were exposed to. In the neighborhood, without leaving to go places, there were so many kids. There was always a football game or a baseball game in the streets. All kinds of activities. And annually we had a block party. We closed off the street. It was started off being a Labor Day. We blocked off the street, and then there were, just like any country fair, there were food, desserts, grills going, races going, pretty much everything that you can think of right there in the middle of the street. And we look forward to it every year. And this is all run by the parents.
I already know the answer, but I assume television wasn't a big part of your life. It sure wasn't part of mine.
It was not. No, we did get a television, and it was black and white, rabbit ears, just like everybody had back then. I remember one day Mom and Dad came in with a color television, and that entertained us probably for a half an hour, and then we went back out in the streets. We had a hi-fi stereo, so we had records and radio, and they were also entertaining. My parents have very eclectic music taste, so we had a lot of 33 RPM records that we used to play until we wore additional grooves in them. I don't want to make it sound that like it was super extremely idyllic. We were aware of the rest of the world. We were aware that everything wasn't perfect. And the older I get, the more I find out that my parents fought against some of these inequities in their own way. My cousin Karen recently sent me some documents I'd never seen before. One was written by my father, and then one was sent from the Fourth Ward Civic Association, which, as an aside, developed at that time from the Fourth Ward Men's Club. They decided that they shouldn't have just a men's club, so they formed the association. And there's some other details in there that I'm not aware of. But these documents, my father wrote a very particular, persnickety letter to both the school board and the government of the town of Cheverly about the fact that while there were schools closer to us that our children could attend, they were being shipped to schools further away. Just typical story, busing, but busing to keep schools segregated. So they wrote these letters, and then the association sent it. And the one that's the most remarkable to me is that the mayor at the town, I believe his name was Wirtz, who was a white man and ruled pretty much a white town, signed on to this and wrote a pretty scathing letter to the Board of Education saying that this is not right. I've just found these things recently, and I'm kind of looking for more, but it pointed out to me once again that the adults in our neighborhood didn't just sit back and take it, but they also didn't wear it on their sleeves. Most of us just ran and played in the streets, and our parents did these things we didn't even know they were doing. But they did not take this. And because of their attitude and Mr. Curry's attitude, Wayne Curry was the first student from our side of the world to attend Bladensburg High School. And there's a picture there of a class picture, Amanda, if you could pull that one up. On the first row, the next to last on the right is Chuck Watkins. And on the middle row with a blazer and a red shirt, 2 over from the teacher, is my brother George. And this was at Cheverly Tuxedo Elementary School. Now, we didn't realize how big a deal this was at the time, but they were among the first ones to be allowed to go to Cheverly Tuxedo Elementary. The rest of us had gone to Beaver Heights.
Joseph,
So,
about what year would this picture
oh, I
be?
knew you were gonna, this is 1965.
Okay.
It's on the, only reason I know is because it's on the sign in the front.
Oh, great. Excellent. Nothing like having a cue card there.
Yeah, so they would have been about 9 at the time because my brother was born in 56. So Chuck and George would have been about 9. But, you know, it's just a normal class picture, but they were among the first to be accepted at Cheverly Tuxedo Elementary School.
Joseph, let me ask you about, I've talked about schools, a little bit about activities. What about churches?
There was one church in our neighborhood, and the building is still there, but it's had several different names. It was Grace Baptist at one time. My mother sent us for a couple of years to Vacation Bible School there. Our church, the one that the family attended, was in DC, Shiloh Baptist Church. And part of the reason we attended that one is because it was a sister church to the family church in Richmond, Virginia, Fifth Street Baptist. So it was familiar territory, but we drove there every Sunday to go to services. We didn't catch the bus, and you couldn't walk. The next nearest church that I was aware of later on is, and I believe it's the same name, but now it's Cheverly United Methodist Church. And St. Ambrose is also here in town. But yeah, we didn't go there.
So we have community activities keeping young men and young women, boys and girls busy. I get the sense today that there's something called helicopter parents, where children outside are at great risk and they have to be monitored with some kind of implant and then radar to track them on GPS because we are worried. Talk a little bit about sort of freedom of movement. I guess I'm asking a leading question because I know how it was for me. I mean, I had an area where I could go, but I was pretty free to wander because there were people watching me at every house that I bypassed.
That's exactly right. The family kept an eye out. You couldn't get away with anything, unfortunately. But we weren't really verbally restricted very much. We were turned loose. We just kind of knew how far we could go without coming back in and getting permission. So for us, it was mostly the Fourth Ward. There are kind of finite barriers there. And for the most part, there was not a whole lot of anything else to do except in the woods. So you stayed on your street and played with your buddies. There's now a park down there. It's named after Mr. Boyd. So when I first came back to Cheverly, I was beginning to be a helicopter parent because of where I had lived before. And my son was over at my mom's house and she turned him loose and let him go down to the park. And it caught me by surprise. I had to take a deep breath and I just, well, you know, it's just 3 blocks and you used to go down there when you were a kid. And so there were trees there instead of swings. It's a different attitude and a different atmosphere here. And I'm going to have to spread just a little further beyond the Fourth Ward. Cheverly has a lot of unique qualities to it, but one of them is that the family atmosphere. And once we got past the years where color was a barrier and we realized that we were pretty much of a town, and there are exceptions, so it's not all peaches and cream, but for the most part, it's a family town. We have an annual day called Cheverly Day, and it's open to the town. Their food, their games, now we have beer garden and wine. Back at that time, we didn't. Scouts would have their expositions, the clubs would have their displays. And the first time we took George there, he was probably 6, maybe a little older. And it was the first place that we could take him, that we could just turn him loose, let him have fun, and know nothing would happen, and know that he wouldn't go anywhere, because you have these barriers like streets, but you have all the adults who would say, where are you going? If you tried to cross the street, where's your mom and dad? And they'd corral you back in. So I have to give credit to the town of Cheverly for that kind of an attitude, but in the Fourth Ward, it was even more so. There were these things in the streets that you just knew, well, I can't go there till I go back home and ask first. Maybe they were like the magnets in the parking lots that stop a grocery cart from going any further. But we knew what the limits were, and sometimes you passed them, but you had a good time whether you did or not.
As we get to the mid-60s, and I'm thinking back to the stories that you told one night that I was privileged to hear, and we were talking about when the first Black family moved into the other Cheverly, on the other side of the tracks, and you wonderfully told, I think you said, people held their breath and nothing happened.
Exactly.
Did I remember
right.
that right? Do you want to tell? You need to say that in your words.
I was old enough to understand some of what was going on, but not really old enough to understand all of the ramifications. But I know there were some mumblings going on through the town. And you kind of hear these in the adults. And if you're a little bit older, you're a young teenager, your ears go up so you can hear what's going on. Sometimes you actually even ask the question, but mostly you just sort of eavesdropped and listened to what's going on. And you could hear the rumors about people of our color had bought a home and were going to move in on the other side of Cheverly. And it was right on Cheverly Avenue, by the way, which is kind of unheard of. So we understood that everybody on our side was waiting to see what would happen. Nobody really expressed any pre-conclusions or expectations. We were just kind of waiting. And then I heard that they were moving in tomorrow. And of course, I wanted to go up there, but it was beyond those magnets in the street, so I didn't go up there, nor did anybody else that I know of. And then for the next couple of days, there was no talk about it, and it was like everybody had let out a big sigh. Black people had moved into the other part of Cheverly, and it's almost like nobody cared. It's done, let's move on. And pretty much that's the way it's been since then. Of course, there's some exceptions. There are diehards everywhere, and there are people, if we didn't have two opinions, then life wouldn't be very much fun. But this particular instance, the watershed event turned out to be, bread that didn't rise. It just happened and we moved on. But I will always remember that, because now this is my town. My town was able to handle this without any uproar.
When did you move? So you don't currently live in Ward 4?
I do not. I live in Cheverly, but I don't live in Ward 4.
So when did you transition? When did you grow up and arrive in where you are now?
Oh, okay. I'm going to have to ask Susan to unmute herself. 32 years ago, Susan?
Uh-oh, you're in trouble.
I know.
She moved here in July of 1991.
Okay, that long ago.
that
But
long ago.
we did not, we're now in the second ward, or Ward 2, but we're not in the fourth ward.
Got it. Yep, just trying to understand a little bit of the transition.
Yeah, there were a few years in between where I was elsewhere, Army, college, wandering. But when Susan and I got together and we talked about places to live, I had talked about Cheverly enough. She said, well, let's go look in Cheverly. We did, and I'll probably leave Cheverly before she does.
We'll address that in the questions and answers.
Okay.
I want to go back to Old War IV, and I don't think have I missed anything in questions that I should be asking you about sort of life there, and you know, how a young man, what you saw and what you did, and how people thought. Is there anything I should be asking you?
Well, a lot of what I'm about to say, I didn't learn until much later. Of course, I knew my parents' backgrounds. My parents, you know, a teacher, a chaplain, a soldier. I was a triple threat, you know, preacher's kid, Army brat, and a teacher's kid. But because of that, there were things that they wanted us to experience that you couldn't necessarily get here in town. So my summers were often filled with things like, I went 2 summers to Howard University for the entire summer while everybody else was playing. And I attended National Science Foundation programs at Howard University, which included some college levels classes. This is, I think, 9th and 10th grade, maybe 10th and 11th grade. One year, my mom suggested I should probably take a class in typing because that would help. And I had my plans for my electives, so I didn't take typing. And my mom signed me up for typing during the summer because she thought I needed to know how to type. And I will say, to her credit, when I got to college, I used to type other people's papers for a few bucks because I could type and they could not. So it's not, at the time, it didn't feel really right. But looking back on it, you know, mom and dad were right. We had people in our neighborhood who worked at the No Name Agency, National Security Agency out near at Fort Meade. I just found out recently, I knew one of my adult neighbors spoke a couple of languages, but I found that he spoke like 6 or 8 languages fluently. But he didn't lord it over us. Another one down the street who worked out at Fort Meade was a cryptologist, an expert cryptologist. I never knew where he worked, either of them. I knew where he worked when he came to me and said, they're doing a background check on you. And because I worked out there, and he just told me, it's time for your background. They're going to be knocking on doors. And I said, well, how do you know? He said, well, yeah, because they knocked on my door and I work out there. So he told, we had teachers and principals. We had a woman who was a math genius. She worked at the time it was the Army Mapping Service. I think it's the National, I'll remember the name in a moment. My brother went to work for her one summer. The people at the end of the street, the husband had his PhD and the wife had a master's in education. We had people who work for the government printing office also. We had teachers, we had, I want to say normal occupations, but that's, for me, that's belies the neighborhood. We had a lot of adults on that one block who worked in the upper middle levels of employment. And they brought that to bear on the neighborhood. And so anybody who moved into the neighborhood, rather than bringing the neighborhood down, so to speak, was absorbed. And if they were just absorbed into the neighborhood, and everybody kind of equalized.
Yeah, I think that's important. It was when it comes to professional and sort of world experience, it was diversity. Yes. In your neighborhood, and yet it was still a tight-knit community, people with worldly experience, but working together.
Yep.
I think that's part of the story that I've learned from you. They came from different backgrounds with different knowledge base, but they all worked towards the same thing, which is family.
Absolutely.
Which held things together.
Mhm.
So we've talked about churches. We talked about schools. Ward 4, when you were growing up, was it was in the city of Cheverly, right?
It was town.
You're
It was in the town of Cheverly, and it was actually incorporated into the town of Cheverly shortly after the town itself became incorporated. It has had some other names like South Cheverly, Tuxedo Colony, or the Colony, and eventually it just sort of adopted the name, the Ward 4 or Fourth Ward. But yeah, it was adopted into the town of Cheverly very shortly after it was incorporated, and I'm thinking it was like 5 years after.
So did it have its own council person, or was the council district that it was in bigger than Ward 4 itself?
No, each ward has its own council person, and for most of the time, from the beginning, our council people were white. Mr. Ely, who was a commissioner for the National Capital Park and Planning Commission, if I remember correctly, was the first Black council member elected in the town of Cheverly. And so after that, then we started having darker faces on the council.
Do you sort of have a vague, to the nearest decade when he was elected? Nearest decade.
Mr. Ely was probably elected in the mid to late 60s. And while we're talking, I think I can tell you the exact date, but if not,
well, 1960s. That's earlier than I was going to guess. So there was representation almost from the beginning, which is interesting.
Yeah.
John Peter.
Well, there were uphill battles toward that goal. Are we running long?
Yeah, how did you know?
Do we have questions, Amanda?
We do. We have about 10 minutes left, and we do have a couple of questions in here that I would love to get to.
Well, we want to hear the questions.
Perfect. Okay. First question is from Karen. How old were you when your dad came home from the service?
Oh, trick question.
Well, I'm going to give you two answers. When we moved here, I was 9. He went away to Korea. So I was 11 when he came back from Korea. But then he had a couple of other tours, and Dad finally retired when I was graduated from high school in 1965. So I was 17, I think, maybe 16. But I'm glad you asked that question, because it's another aspect of my life growing up. When Dad went to Korea, he took an 11-year-old young man aside and said, "You're going to be the head of the house while I'm gone. Take care of your mother."
Wow.
I knew I was not the head of the house. Mom was the head of the house. But that was quite a moment for me.
Wow.
But I'm guessing you did just fine.
Well, you'll have to ask my siblings. I think I did okay. We survived.
Fantastic. The next question comes in from Amy. Was there a way to get across 50 before the metro was built?
Only walking, bicycles, and cars. There was no public transportation crossing that bridge at all. None.
Wow. And here's a really good question that I definitely wanted to make time for. Tanya asked, there is a move to demolish the houses in the county that are 50 to 60 years old. And I think we should preserve all the homes in good repair that are lived in and maintained by the owners. What are your thoughts on the homes in Ward 4?
Wow. I'm not so sure I should answer that. I should probably defer that to someone else. I think the key to your question is what was included in the question. If the homes are lived in and they're in good repair, why would we tear them down? If they're vacant and abandoned, that's a different issue. But even there, if somebody can turn it into a loving home, why not let them? I don't think there's any justification for tearing down a house just because it's old. We have newer houses that we should tear down also. I hope I avoided that answer skillfully.
I think it was a wonderful non-answer. And that's actually all the questions we have in the chat box. But I do want to go back to the beginning of the slideshow so that everyone can enjoy it. If you do have questions, please add them into the chat box as we go through the slideshow. And Joseph, feel free to add in any memories. We've got about 5 minutes left, but by all means,
I will go as quickly as I can, and you can push the button to the next slide whenever you're ready. This is a picture of my mom and my father on their wedding day in Richmond, Virginia. The next 3 pictures are birthday parties that I described before. You can't see, but if you look to the left out the window, that's my dad's legs. The next one you'll see, you can actually see the tie and suit that he's wearing. Not as well as I thought, but he's out there in a suit and tie while we're having a birthday party. The next birthday party is my Uncle Jim and my Aunt Sue. And the head right in the foreground is my cousin Karen, who I believe is on this chat. And then my brother George is at the back, and the tallest one on the left is my brother Jim. The tallest one on the right is my sister Lillian.
Joseph, I don't want to interrupt, but we didn't mention suits.
Yes, the previous picture showed my dad outside in a suit and tie while we're inside having a party, because it's a birthday party for kids, and even though it's Saturday afternoon, nobody's going to work, they put on suit and tie to attend these things. It's just the way it was. And it was a good example. That's the left is my brother George, the right is my cousin Jim Curry. They're just playing in the front yard and posing for the picture. Those the same 2 kids. That was our backyard early on when we first moved there. That fence was long gone. And the tree up to your right is where we played tetherball all summer long. Again, my brother in the wagon, my cousin Jim pulling, and I just forgot the young lady's name, but she lived down the street from us. And the next one is the same 3 kids, but my dad is, I'm assuming he's consoling my brother. He might have been reprimanding my brother, but that's just a nice memory for me. Now, that picture, if you'll hold that black and white one for right now, and did I cut it off? Can you see the bottom? Maybe not. Okay, let's go left to right. Left is Chuck Watkins, then is Richard Watkins, my brother George, Steve Watkins, and my cousin Jim Curry. The Watkins boys lived across the street. We talked about them earlier. They're some of my longest living friends. And you have to look carefully, and I know Jim Curry is going to reprimand me if he ever sees this, but Jim had a little issue with dressing himself, and it got to be funny after a while, but both feet are through the same leg of his shorts. The other leg is hanging free, and this was a routine happening, so I had to include it because this is the young gang that came after our generation, but I love them all dearly. I love Jim dearly, but whenever I get an opportunity, I show this picture. Go ahead, go on to the next one. That's me at the top right, my brother Jim, my brother George, and Jim Curry again. Now, these are on the steps in front of 1703 where we grew up. Another family, this is on Easter Sunday. We had come back from church and everybody's in their Sunday finest. The same 4 characters plus my sister Lil. And then the next one has my father in uniform, my little brother George, my sister, and my mom. I could not have picked better parents if I'd been given an opportunity. This is another generation. This is my brother's wife and 3 of his children. in front of the house at 1703. You asked about cars earlier. That's one of Mom's cars right there, the burgundy one. And they always got cars big enough to carry lots of children in them. Let's see what's next. And then the rest of these, in the foreground is my mother. And then there's my sister to the left. And right in the middle is my daughter, Angela. The rest of those are cousins and nieces and nephews. And this is another event. I don't remember which one it is, but there are about 4 or 5 pictures there where, you know, before dinner or after dinner was time to go outside and take some pictures. Nieces, nephews, and daughters clowning around. They're imitating a picture they had seen, which is another whole story. That's my daughter and another cousin, Majaliwa. Angela's in the foreground. That's my son's oldest, James, and more of the cousins. And then up, that's Carla right there in the middle, my niece. And Erin on the left is another niece, and there's Mom with some of her grandkids. And of course, the older grandkids are clowning around in the background again. We could probably go on for days, but I tried to get a small group that represented some of our experiences there during that time.
Well, Joseph, it's been an hour, I think, and I am very grateful that you took the time to have this chat. I think it's important. We are recording this, that we start remembering living history and getting a view for posterity of where we came from, and always hearing your stories. I think they're great. So I thank you for the time. It's been really great.
John Peter, thank you for inviting me to do this. I didn't hesitate because I knew I'd be okay in your hands, but also I knew I was talking about familiar territory. And I'm looking at all the names now that I can see a bunch of people. I've got a lot of friends there who turned in, and I want to thank each and every one of you for doing so. I hope you feel the time was well spent. And if you have more questions afterwards, because I'm sure I said some things that you're going, huh? Just ask me anytime you want. Thank you again, John Peter, and thank you, Donna and Amanda.
Oh, thank you, Joseph. And to be honest, some of your memories triggered a few of mine when I was an Air Force brat down in North Carolina. So I remember a few of those kind of stories myself. So
I'd love to hear them.
One day we'll have to get together and we can chat.
Good.
Again, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. We hope you join us for our next chat, which will be on Monday, May 24th at 7 o'clock, where the Society's historian Susan Pearl will be having a conversation with Professor William Thomas about his new book called A Question of Freedom and the families who challenged slavery from the nation's founding to the Civil War. So again, thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you again at another chat. Good night.
Good night.
Night.